For those who don't know, Evan, would you mind introducing yourself real quick?
Hello, I'm Evan Yil. I'm the author of Vue.js and Vite, and I'm an independent open source developer. Yeah.
Yeah. For a less humble version, Evan is the legend that proved you can challenge norms as an individual developer. You can make something at the same time as Facebook's investing in React and still deliver an insane, truly amount of value. It's been awesome to watch all of the work you've done and how you've continued growing the community. And I'd love to ask just how did you get started? Why did you build a framework?
Yeah, so the story, I guess I didn't set out to build like a framework of what we know of as of today, right? It started as just an experiment, just really to just scratch my own itch when I was working at Google Creative Labs, and we were doing a lot of fast prototypes, and some of my colleagues used AngularJS, and I checked it out and was like, okay, some of these concepts looks great because the declarative like bindings are much better than say the manual bindings of jQuery or Backbone when we were using at the time. But at the same time, I looked more into it and I was like, okay, there are a bunch of stuff that I don't really care about because it brought about a lot of these like dependency injection or like Java-esque stuff, which I just don't feel needed in my work. And then I was also looked into the implementation. I was realized, okay, this is actually doing this kind of brute force dirty checking. I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I realized, okay, maybe you can implement, auto tracking dependencies using ES5 getter setters. So that was the main motivation, really just first of all, I want to create a lighter, less bloated version of just encapsulating the template, directive binding, reactive state kind of setup. And also I want to play with the implementation idea. Like, can we do this by just tracking everything with getters and setters? So that was the initial version of Vue, really. But later on, people liked it, so I spent more time working on it, and just adding more and more stuff into it. Eventually, it become what it is today.
That's fascinating to hear. It really feels like your focus was on one specific aspect and you almost had to build everything around it. And I
Yeah.
feel like that theme stayed true through other things you've built. And I'm curious, I know it's pretty far off, but how'd you end up building a bundler later on with Vite?
Yeah, that's a similar story, right? Well, I always all of my projects start with something real that I encountered myself during my work, and the reason of building V started out because of my own frustration with Vue CLI. So so going back a few years, we realized, okay, we need an official build setup for Vue apps because we came up with this single file component thing, and you need to have a build tool for it. So and setting up everything correctly with Webpack was a headache for most people. So we were like, okay, we need to build a CLI around Webpack. So we built Vue CLI, and I think we went a bit too far with Vue CLI. Like I felt like we abstracted too much, trying to do too much work inside of it. And in the end, the maintenance burden was huge. And still, like when we were, and one day I was just like I have a simple idea. I want to spin up a VCI app, and it took me like 2 minutes to install the depps, then like 20 seconds to spin up the dev server. And I was like, this is not how it should be. Like we need some lighter way to do this, right? And that's around the time when like Chrome started landing native ESM imports directly in the browser. So I was like, okay, can I import a view file and let Chrome handle that? So I built a prototype and realized, okay, this is actually sending an HTTP request to the server and expecting to get a JavaScript module back, even though you're using a .view extension in the import specifier. So I was like, okay, this might actually just work. So I built a prototype that was in 2019 that just transforms the view file into JavaScript on the fly and send it back, and that worked. So I was like, okay, this looks like it has potential. But I was also boggled down in Vue 3 work around that time, so I put that idea aside and kept working on Vue 3. So when Vue 3 was about done, I was like, maybe it's also time to have a lighter weight uh, build toolchain for Vue 3 as well. So I picked up the idea again, and that was around like April 2020. And I started building, basically just expanding on the idea. So when I was researching the idea, a few other solutions also kind of popped up. Like when I was working through, so my original goal was to get hot module replacement on top of my previous prototype. That was the main thing. So once I finished I once I cracked the hot module replacement, I realized, okay, this is something that I can actually use and push further. So I started doing more research and realized, okay, there are some other projects like uh, at web/dev server. It was called ES dev server back then, and then was Snowpack also. So these tools kind of, I don't know the exact time like when each have started, but I started doing more research on these things after I've got the hot module replacements working, and I realized, okay, like kind of doing a lot of similar things, but I think Vite was the first one that actually shipped with hot module replacement around that time. So that was the time we kind of have entered a sort of like a little bit of competition with Snowpack. We're like shipping features here and there, and to the point where I guess I think like we each like sort of look at what each other is doing and like try to reach feature parity on the other side. But I think in the end, Snowpack team essentially they were starting to build Astro on top of Snowpack, and they realized that their energy is better spent by focusing on the higher level thing they want to build. So maintaining Snowpack in parallel just doesn't make sense for them because the two are really doing very similar things. So they decided to switch feeds. I think that was a moment where we kind of thought, okay, Vite is kind of could actually serve as a not just a bundler, but more like a shared infrastructure if you want to quickly build meta frameworks on top of. So so outside of the I think the best decision we made is first splitting Vite to become framework agnostic because in the beginning I only wanted to for Vue. I was like, this is going to be a Vue only thing,
I
right? But
specifically remember when you first posted the Twitter demo with like the
yeah,
React HMR working, and you were like, "I think this works. Can some React devs try it?" And I was one of the first to play with it.
yeah.
I was like, "Oh my god, this is dope!" I was on Snowpack at the time. I
Yeah.
was just excited for more and more build tools that like we could use, and I was on the deal. I did not expect you to do that at all. And as soon as I saw it, I was hyped.
Yeah, I think that was the probably the best decision because so once we became framework agnostic, we realized we can abstract a lot more. And another decision we made was to Jason Miller, author of Preact, he worked on a Preact specific thing called WMR. I think yeah, WMR. He never told anyone what the acronym really means, but I guessed it was warm module replacement, something. Uh, but the great idea he had there was to have simulate rollups plugin pipeline directly in the browser, directly not in the browser, like still in Node.js, but you're not actually running rollup itself. You just simulate the plugin pipeline in the dev server without running rollup itself. So it becomes rollup compatible, rollup plugin compatible, but you're not actually running rollup, which is a great idea. So we kind of took that idea, moved it into Vite. That became Vite 2.0. And then we realized the potential is not just a bundler, but also we encapsulate a lot of these out of the box conventions that we see because like previously if you look at create react app vue cli and almost every webpack boilerplate
Mhm.
out there, we're all doing more or less the same things like how to import css, how to handle hot module replacement, how to transpile ts, right? So every meta framework in the future is going to need that kind of stuff. So what if we just make it out of the work out of the box? It's just like convention based. Everybody's going to do the same thing. And you can, if you're building a new meta framework, is there's really no point in repeating all of this stuff again. So I think that kind of made sense to people. So Astro is now built on Vite, SpileKit is built on Vite, Solid Start is built on Vite, Quick is built on Vite. And the cool thing is because Vite is framework agnostic, like by using Vite, you just like naturally can support Vue and React at the same time and Svelte and anything that works with Vite. So I think
And
that's also a really cool thing that it just evolved out around over time. Like I didn't plan this in the beginning, but like over time we realized, okay, we can do this. It makes it better. So it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really interested to see how that's just expanded further, like with frameworks like Astro, where that goal
Yeah,
of like support everything and like being a layer has went way further. Their intent wasn't to
yeah,
build a meta framework for everyone the same way Vite wasn't. But the
yeah,
result is now I'm seeing more and more developers using Astro as the starting point to play with new server side
yeah,
rendered frameworks. And it's cool how like Vite feature creeped its way from a transpiler to a like a meta framework build tool kit, and
yeah,
the things built around it have almost been pushed the same way.
yeah.
Yeah, it's such a cool thing to see. And yeah, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on how the communities approach this, both from like or on the Vite side, but also on the Vue side. Like, what has it been like to have these huge communities form and do all these crazy things with the
Mhm.
technology, and how has that influenced your decision making with it?
I guess the best part of it is the size of the community obviously also makes it financially sustainable for me to do this full time. So like I really have nothing to complain about the lifestyle. Like going independent was probably the best decision I made, and I get to work with awesome people on the internet. I mean, without COVID, I get to travel around the world and meet people all over the place who use my work. So yeah, that has been super amazing. And I think another amazing part is when you have something that people like, you get to meet people who are also genuinely passionate about this and the success of it. So like I really didn't like I don't think I'm a good like manager type of person, but like our teams are just naturally formed in a way. Like people are just like it so much they do a lot of great work. So I was like, okay, do you want to just join the team and officially be part of it? Uh, like both the Vue team and the V team grew very organically. I probably was a bit more intentional about the V team because I know that splitting my time between the two projects is going to make it really difficult. So in a way, I started at a much earlier time planning for building a team for Vite. Uh, and I think that was also great. Like Vite also, because we made it framework agnostic, it just allows more collaboration even across ecosystems. Like we have contributors from the Svelte side, from Astro side, from Vue side. So it's like the V team is really like we have collaborators from all different frameworks. Yeah,
Yeah, I've definitely seen that as well. And like just some of the stuff I've seen, like again, close with the Astro guys, I watched the whole snowpack hype cycle crash and burn wherever it ended up. And watching them move from maintaining snowpack and building Astro around it to moving to Vite and contributing to Vite and helping to push it forward has been super cool to see. And seeing like Vite now be
yeah,
sponsored directly and being able to pay developers themselves to form its own full organization that can go well
yeah.
past what any one person could do now. It's really cool to see.
Yeah. I actually want to give a shout out to Fred, because I think it takes a lot of. I mean, I have a lot of respect for him making the decision to switch from Snowpack to Vite. I think it was the right call, but it's not the easy call, right? Like when you work on something for so long, you're just attached to it. Uh, and I have a lot of respect for him to be able to make that decision.
Yeah, I fully agree, and it's rare to see people that willing to throw stuff away. And honestly, as a
Yeah,
half as a pivot, half because I just think it's interesting. The
yeah.
relationship between Next and or well between Next and React fascinates me in this way, where Next had
Mhm.
its own server side paradigms that they had invented and pushed for like half a decade at this point that a lot of
Mhm.
people invested in and adopted, and they were at like as soon as React had developed a pattern that looked vaguely better to them, they're willing to throw it all away and work directly with React to make it happen. And I think
Mhm.
that level of innovation resulting in collaboration is really fascinating. The idea that this thing can be
Mhm.
built on the outside of React to solve problems React isn't interested in. And then when React has interest, it's now a platform rather than a standard. And Next.js, the standard, has been almost entirely thrown out so that
Mhm.
React, the standard, can grow, and Next, the platform, is the place where it can happen. And I would love to hear like I've just because I've seen so much cool stuff with Nux
Mhm.
3, the adoption's been insane to see, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on Nuxt and its relationship with Vue.
Yeah. So in a way, Nux has always been. I think it serves a very similar role to Next to as to React. Obviously, the relationship, like in details, is a bit different in the sense that Next has always more or less been they spend a lot of energy on polishing the very fine details of DX, like the small things like auto imports and how like um they're kind of like the extension of me where I'm happy that they exist so I can focus more on the core stuff, on the lower level stuff, and thinking about improvements that happens at a more fundamental level, whereas leaving the sort of more out of the box, streamlined, like zero to product as fast as possible kind of use cases to them. I think that's where the focus is. So we don't. So I agree that the relation between React and Next now is more like uh, I think the fundamental reason is React itself is expanding from a library into an architecture. And in order to manifest that architecture, you need a meta framework. And like Next is the most popular React framework, and it is also the most natural place that should take place. And in a way, I don't think it was like Next throwing everything it had in order to accommodate React. I think the collaboration is more like um, the the meta framework and the core library success is kind of like what is the word like the beneficial
Mhm.
relationship in
The
the
symbiotic.
biology. Yeah, it's symbiotic. So and I think Guillermo, like the folks at Vercel, they are smart people, right? They realize like the because of the relationship, like if React has ambitious ideas, Next would be the best platform for them to push it. Um, I think we don't have that level of collaboration between Vue and Nuxt as of now. In some way, I think we should probably move a bit more towards that direction. Um, but I'm also kind of wary about the fact that React Next and Next are more or less in this like the line between the library and the framework is very blurry now. It's like in a way, React is the library, but also the architecture, and Next is a manifestation of that architecture. The two is kind of inseparable now. Um, and that happens in a way because Vercel invests so much in hiring React people, and for us, I personally still want to have that relatively clear boundary in the sense that meta frameworks on top of Vue are implemented using clearly defined public APIs. It shouldn't be the case where like we ship a new feature and everybody's like, how can I use it? You must use Nuxt. And how do I implement it myself? Well, it's kind of complicated. Um, I kind of want to avoid that.
I I hear you, but
Yeah.
I think that there's some like understandable but core misunderstandings of how like the relationship with React and Next work. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously I'm privy to much more detail than the average person
Mm-hmm.
here, but like to me, what I've clearly seen is the React core team has gotten more excited about server side problems and wanting
Yeah.
to bridge that gap more. Every person
Mm-hmm.
who has moved to Vercel or is an ex meta person that has like restarted their career to be at Vercel, like Tom, who's just been retired for a few years now, like
Mm-hmm.
they're doing this not because Vercel offered them a bunch of money. It's because they're excited. This is the thing that
Sure.
they got into React for happening again. It to me and to everyone I've talked to, there isn't a single person who's like, yeah, they paid me a lot. All of them are as hyped as ever, and these are people I've been talking to for years, and it does feel like a moment, and that's the thing I wanted to like push for is it feels like there's a moment happening right now in the Nuxt community, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
almost scared you're not part of it because of concern that these things will get too close. And I'm kind of
Yeah.
reporting from
Okay.
the
I
other
get it.
end that the magic
Sure.
of when that happens is worth the risk.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think so. Obviously, everything I said previously about the relationship between Vercel and React and all that, I didn't mean it as a criticism. It's
Mhm.
more like an observation, and I'm obviously also thinking about it. Like I'm not 100% sure if like this is the like it's more like okay, this is interesting, but I'm not 100% sure whether this is like gonna be for the better or for the worse. Uh, like there's definitely the upside of it, where like the closer collaboration allows you to think about the whole full stack server paradigm in a more holistic way. I think there's great value in that. On the other side, there's also I guess it's mostly about React essentially redefining itself. It's something different now, right? It's a moment where React says, I'm no longer just a client-side library. We are going to own the server. We're going to be a server or like server client coherent paradigm. And I think that's, obviously that's an exciting thing to work on. Um, I'm just personally myself thinking about like, does it make sense for Vue? Like the thing is, like it's a trend, it's an observation that people are excited about, but like does it make sense for every single framework out there to chase the same paradigm? Would it be the best if every framework in the future, like even if you're saying you're front end framework, you actually say the best way to use us is you use JavaScript backend, right? I personally have reservations about that. Maybe a bit conservative on their front, but I'm not completely closed off to the idea of exploring that in Vue, right? So, and to do that, obviously, we have to collaborate with Nux because that is the platform where we can explore that. So, so anyway, yeah, I guess like I don't have a very solid conclusion on like what my take on this is. Like I'm just really just going through my head saying, okay, like this is definitely something exciting and interesting. Like we're thinking about it too, but we'll see how it goes.
Totally fair.
Yeah.
I think that SSR doesn't have to be this like all or nothing type like mentality of this means you have a JavaScript backend that serves your whole application. I've seen a lot of
Yeah.
companies move to models where they treat
Yeah.
Next or even Nuxt as like a preprocessor to send correct HTML with good metadata down to their users as
Mhm.
simply as possible. And they still have their crazy backends written in like Terraform, Kubernetes, chaotic, Golang, whatever the hype is
Yeah.
in that world nowadays. I don't care. I just write Lambda functions. They work fine. But the I've seen a lot of developers building with these tools as an abstraction layer that they've chosen to define on top of other infrastructure. And it's still,
Mhm.
for the most part, a client side app on one side and crazy old school infra the other. They're treating the framework as like an alternative to GraphQL almost. It's the layer that lets you perfectly define a backend for your
Mhm.
client such that the developer experience and the performance of the app both have significant wins. And I think at whatever, like you can adopt these patterns however much, there are a few apps that don't benefit some amount from it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think my if I were to cl like specify a little bit, I guess my some of my reservations roots from the idea that even though when you have a framework that claims that you can do pure static, you can still use it for SPAs and all that. The narrative is very clear now that the best way to use Next is to use Apter and React Server components. Um, and for better or worse, a lot of users don't really know what is would be best for their use case, and they would just use whatever the thing recommends as the default, and they don't like. And in my opinion, the way currently React Server Components is implemented does add a bunch of mental overhead that isn't necessarily a worthwhile trade-off if you're building pure client-side stuff. So that's just my take. I think
Yep.
it comes at some potential mental overhead if you are for the group of users who are like, okay, I don't really need service stuff. Um, so is it the best idea to say have a silver bullet that can do everything
I
in the same solution, or is it better to have say React the core library, a bunch of different meta frameworks that's niche case completely optimized for a very specific case, right? I think Next is trying to be the silver bullet for everything, and I think it could be potentially it could succeed at that, but there's also the potential where trying to be a thing that can solve every problem end up complicating the situation for some of the more specific
Mhm.
cases.
I I don't want to push back directly so much as challenge you with like a reframing. This took a bit for me to click too, like especially server components. I was super skeptical initially. The
Hmm.
the reframing that's clicked for me to go back to the point of defaults is there is no better default than a static app being built when you're done and sending HTML to your user if that's a thing you're capable of doing with the application you're building. If it can be fully static, it should be
Hmm.
fully static. Dynamic behavior should be added as it is wanted by the developer. And if the
Hmm.
default is fully static or fully dynamic, like it was in the Create React app era, or even starting a new app with Vite right now, that is a bad default that you won't know is bad if you don't know better. And generally
Hmm.
speaking, it's best to start with the thing that is the best use case for the user with the
Right.
smallest amount of complexity possible and add complexity as you're doing things that are a worse experience for the user. Ideally, the minimal amount to do the thing you're trying to do. And I think that was when React Server Components really clicked for me. It's you're building a static app until you choose something to be interactive and you're making a
Hmm.
decision, okay, here will be JavaScript because here I am saying this is interactive. You're drawing your own interactive boundaries in your app. And yes, that is a new concept. And that's weird because we know how these things actually work underneath. But from my experience talking to new developers, it's actually been easier to communicate in this way where you're building a page. And if you want part of that page to have a button that you can click, you have to tell React, hey, this thing can be interacted with. It's a client thing. I hate the word use client. It should have been used interactive. I'll fight on this till the day I die. But I really, when it clicked really hard. And the goal was specifically to drive us towards the best thing until we have a reason to break out. Because it'll be obvious when the button click doesn't work. It won't be as obvious when the SSR doesn't, or when SSR doesn't happen, you don't have metadata in your app as a result.
Okay. Yeah. So you're essentially looking at it more as like it's kind of like Astro, right? Like
Yes
you
and no.
start.
It
Yeah.
so
Obviously, there are
yes.
differences. Like I mean, the general idea of starting with something as static as possible and opting into interactivity.
Yes, what's interesting with server components is it takes two of my favorite things and
Hmm.
abstracts an entire layer from them and makes it better. So one of my other favorite things, are you familiar with TRPC?
Yeah.
I love TRPC, the ability to like write back in code in TypeScript and immediately have to correct inferred type safety on my client is magical. But I could also just await the backend function now. And that's like
Hmm.
as great as TRPC is and still is. It made a really good abstraction on top of a problem, which was the relationship between the server and the client with communicating data in an RPC like fashion with API requests. Now that server components exist, I could just await the function. I don't need an
Right.
abstraction because TypeScript does what it's supposed to there now. With
Hmm.
Astro, if I wanted interactivity, I had to mount a client side framework and it let me do that. The Islands of Interactivity
Right.
was incredible, but I had to, as I was starting development, say, okay, I know already here's where the component's going to be because I need a Vue component here or a Svelte component or a React component because I know this is going to be interactive.
Hmm.
And if you know that ahead of time, you know exactly where the boundary is. Awesome, do it. But we don't always know. And the ability to move these things around and not have to think about composability or not like when you abstract these
I
boundaries and
see.
just get rid of them, a whole new level of composability is unlocked. And that's what I'm seeing here that I didn't
But
have before.
right. But server components and client components work differently though. Like, so when you have, say, when you already implemented a tree where some of them are using await directly in your component body, some of them are using use state, and you want to now shift the boundary around, you still have to do quite a significant amount of refactoring, like move these things around. No?
Yes and no. It depends on how low you make the interactive pieces and how often you use the ability to pass server components as
Mm,
children to client components, which is a very powerful aspect that gets around a lot of these types of things. There's new
mm,
patterns we're going to find and develop through these things. It almost feels similar to like you can't have in a React component, you can't do an early return before additional hooks. Like that's a weird thing, but we got over it pretty quick. I think a lot of these things, hopefully at least, and this is what I can't know until I've seen developers shipping it for years, it feels like React is nudging us into better patterns by doing this in a similar fashion.
Great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. The one last thing I wanted to push back on is like the fact that it's just Next is the way to use React now. I've seen a lot of very talented developers, especially Daishi. He's one of the developers at Poimanders. They
Hmm.
do a lot of cool libraries in the React ecosystem. He's got a fully functioning React server component framework that he built in like a few days for fun, already working
What?
really well. And I am super hyped on the direction that he's pushing that in. That might become a legitimate
Mhm.
framework. And
And
it,
it's on top of Vite, right?
yes, super cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
I I actually heard Ryan Carniano make this argument originally, and I've been thinking a lot about it. The use server, use client directives in React actually make it easier to build a new meta framework from scratch and target files and know what they are. Like, yes, it's
Mm.
different enough from previous models that it's not going to be a drop in replacement in existing things, but you can build a better meta framework around these new primitives so easily that Next was the first willing to do it. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of plumbing they can carry over, but it does legitimately feel like, as a person who's been developing Next for years, most of Next
Mm.
has been thrown away and rebuilt because of
Okay.
how powerful these new patterns are.
It's great. Yeah, I'm glad I get to, get these insights from someone who's more closer to the stack. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I'm always down to chat about this stuff, and I'm far from a pure evangelist. I push back more than I compliment nowadays, especially with some of the plans around server actions I've been pushing, and I hope we can get some really cool solutions as a result. But like, yeah, I am genuinely hyped on the direction of things, and I feel like we are using servers more responsibly than we ever have before. And I also think we learned a lot from Nuxt and things like the $ fetch pattern and a lot of the cool like plugin stuff that they've done over there. It's hard to not look over to the other side of the fence and see things that I'm jealous of as we build our own meta frameworks around Next to add the things we like. And Nuxt just has a plugin system that does it all for them. And I just see so much opportunity for both collaboration and, more importantly,
Hmm.
innovation as that bridge
Yeah.
is like, or as that gap is bridged more.
Yeah. Nux actually has an experimental implementation of server components too. But obviously it's kind of flaky. And I believe if we want to actually push it into something usable, it'll require some collaboration from Vue core side to make a certain things easier. But it actually surprised me when they got that prototype out. And yeah, so I guess it proves that this pattern can apply to Vite-based frameworks to frameworks that's built on other core libraries. So it's going to be interesting because this is definitely one of the things we could explore. Um, I guess we want to do it in a more like there are a few things that I feel like we could potentially do differently, like in terms of DX and like how we handle the boundaries, how do you handle the client server separation. But overall, I think we're definitely seeing this sort of, I guess, blending the server and client. Um, I was actually I was actually talking to someone who worked on Wiz at Google yesterday, and Quick is also sort of taking those ideas into a different incarnation of Wiz. And yeah, this all feels a bit interconnected, and it's super interesting. So I hope our next round of sort of big paradigm change in Vue will have something to do with that. But obviously, having a framework that has been around for a very long time, it's always challenging to go through this kind of big changes. So for that, yeah. So I think the React Team is it's very ambitious and also very, I guess it's like the respect goes to the fact that they are willing to go for these huge paradigm shift changes on top of something that has been around for a very long time and is also being used so widely that you don't want to just throw everything away. I mean, in a way, you're saying Next is throwing everything away, but like from the React side, I feel like they're preserving a lot of the good stuff people like about React
Hmm.
and adding this new stuff. So
Yeah.
um, like in a way, like sometimes people will, a lot of people on Twitter think I always talk smack about React. Like the reality is I respect a lot all the people who work on it, and we are obviously having a competition, but it's a friendly competition. I think the end goal is for us to find solutions that would benefit the end users as a whole, to make web dev better as a whole. So it's not really about proving what, like, oh, you can do this better, I can do this better. It's more about looking at things critically and think about, like, there are great ideas here, but there are also small things that maybe cater better to our user base. So there are all these small trade-offs that we can make on a different level.
Yeah, I love that. I think there is so much opportunity here to innovate more than ever before. And like just to emphasize how big of like an L Next had to take in order to do what it's doing now, to this day, I still get like one of the most common messages I get in my chat is, "Hey Theo, when is Create T3 app moving to Next 13?" Because they think Next 13 means you're using the unstable beta app directory, not that you
Mm-hmm.
updated the version to the safest, most up to date version of the package that's fully backwards compatible. Nothing's changed for most users.
Mm-hmm.
The optics of I can't use the latest Next version because I'm not adopting these new React patterns is something they're just
Mm-hmm.
taking because they know it will be worth it in the end to throw away the lead they have in framework adoption if they fail because they're that confident in the collaboration and the opportunity. And a lot of that comes down to Sebastian, to be honest. Like having Sebastian
Mm-hmm.
so hyped about server components, he left Meta to work at Vercel to make it happen is just incredible. And those are the shifts that get me so hyped. And I've seen a truly incredible amount of those over the last couple years. And it's also something I've seen in the Vue ecosystem. Like huge shout out to Daniel C. Rowe. He has been one of the just
Yep.
the coolest people in web dev to talk to. I I think he was my second ever guest on the show way
Oh,
back.
cool.
Yeah, like before I was anybody, back when I got like 10 viewers live. And he just was excited to chat because he wanted to make sure that if we were talking about full stack type safety, that the work Nuxt was doing was being considered. And I was like, "You guys are doing full stack type safety? Yeah, show up, let's talk." And yeah, he helped me prep some questions for this because I wanted to talk to the people in the Vue community I trusted. And it just seems like there is so much like ripe opportunity to not just like challenge the quality of the collaboration going on in the React ecosystem, but to trump it. And with the strength of Vite where it currently is, and the strength of the the like Vue community, and the amount of growth Nuxt has had. Like Nuxt is still one of the fastest growing frameworks right now. I'm pretty sure more projects are started on Nuxt than Vue Vite right now. I could be wrong on that, but it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty incredible. And just like the adoption of Nuxt on the web, like the amount of websites I go to just to check them out, or like go to storefronts and I say, "Hey, this feels fast. What's it built on?" And it's Nuxt. Like almost as much as Next, it feels like nowadays. Like,
I wish there are more Nux 3 sites. I think a
mhm.
lot of the existing Nux sites are still on Nux 2, but Nux 3 is like even better. So I wish to see more of that in the wild.
When do you think we'll see Nuxt in the as like a top level recommendation in the docs, similar to what React did?
Um, in a way, already is. So the overall tone of our main docs is still positions Vue as a client first kind of situation. So our default assumption is you want to build either a static app or an SPA. And then we mentioned, okay, if you want to get like server-side rendering, you want to have dynamic server-side data, you still want to pre-render stuff. We kind of the thing is our audience over time. So this has always been a kind of a theme or a thing that we have to consider when we're writing Vue docs is that our user base seems to cover a lot more beginners who are really sort of just new to front end or web dev in general, and throwing them directly into server-side rendering concepts, it can be a bit daunting for them. So we want to structure it in a way like we introduce you to, okay, think of you as a client-side only thing first. Once you understand that, we'll explain what server-side rendering is. And if you want to actually use this thing, you should use Nuxt. That's the current recommendation, pretty much.
That makes sense. My concern would be, and this is the thing that like I trying to remember how we put this. Like I saw a number recently. I think there are 3 times as many React Vite installations as Vite, which is insane to me. And I actually filed a PR with Create React App, or on not Create React App, on the new React docs, where I swapped Create React App for Vite
Hmm.
because I was so frustrated that we were continuing to recommend a just truly, to put it like kindly, out of date tool. And it was met with a lot of discussion and discourse, but I
Hmm.
was concerned we weren't going to see the change. I would have filed the PR for Next if I thought there was any chance of that, and I didn't. That's because I
Uh-huh.
didn't think so. And I honestly thought React plus Vite was the simplest and closest thing to a good starting point, because I felt exactly how you feel right now, where like mindset of
Yep.
React is as a client side framework. The general use case is as a client side framework. The easiest way to learn it is as a client side framework. The starting point should be a client side framework, and we should hide the server
Hmm.
side under a fold because that's the thing you get to when you need it. The thing that I
Hmm.
have flipped on, and it took a bit. It took Astro. It took talking to Ryan Carniano from Solid constantly. It took Dan Irmov in my DM slowly convincing me over the last year, but I'm convinced server is the best starting point, and client is the thing you
Yeah.
learn to use when you need to, rather than client is the best starting point and server is what you add when you need to.
Yeah, I agree. There is this kind of, it's more like a paradigm shift where you are thinking of, you're no longer talking about front end frameworks, but you're talking about just web frameworks. And in a way, these React is now a whole stack that would put it more in a position that, like when you use the server-side paradigms of React, you're using a stack that competes with something like Rails or Laravel in that sense. You can obviously still pair the two, but it's like the original position in the stack was like in the front end, you need to pair it with the back end, but now it just like kind of overlaps a little bit like
Mm-hmm.
this. And and in a way, like when you introduce that to new users, you kind of have to position yourself like, okay, you're learning actually something that owns more stack than just a client-side framework. You need to understand how a server and the client works, and so there's a lot more concept to cover there, right? Like I'm not saying that it is the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying like it might take some time for the wider audience to sort of accept that change. And I'm in a way I'm happy that React is there to just like go about it, like just go at it. Like overall, I think our audience, the view audience, is a bit more like such like this kind of paradigm shift would be a bit of a too much of a thing to them, but maybe I'm sort of like in this old man yelling out cloud stage. So I'm
I
open to change my mind about that.
I would love to hear more about that because you have more experience than we do in React. We still support class components in
Mm.
2023, and y'all have done much crazier shifts in that regard. Like the Vue 2 to
Yeah.
Vue 3 move was,
Maybe it's just yeah, maybe it's
yeah.
the trauma of me, every time we write up some RFC that sort of in a way I feel like okay, this is sort of like if you want to build some somewhat decent scaled application, you need to understand this. But someone in our community will tell me like, hey, like this is not what I need. Or someone will come up and show me like we like when we try to introduce these two people like on Discord, they are so confused and all that stuff. So very often like I think the reality is that as people who work very closer to the core and to the implementation, we are kind of always excited about the new ideas and thinking about, oh, this is going to be the future, this is the paradigm shift, this is the moment where everything flips. But in reality, the general adoption comes at much a slower stage, and maybe like the work you're doing helps to accelerate that process, which is valuable. But like we have sort of in reality, like for our users, we have a more realistic challenge. Like we need to ramp this up over time instead of just like saying, now you should think of everything as with the server as the first. You know?
That's really fair. I like that a lot. I trying to think how I want to put this thought. I think we got lucky with hooks in a lot of ways. I think
Mhm.
hooks were such an obvious, like, yeah, this is the better way to do this thing that we've been doing. We will start using
Yeah.
them as soon as we can. And like, I was the hooks evangelist when I was working at Twitch, and I was one of the first people shipping major features without any class components being built for them. And it was done in a way where I felt like I was part of a change happening, and I got to be hyped
Mhm.
on this moment. And that excitement is really hard to underrate, and something I firmly believe now that I'm like a CEO, I run companies, I advise many more. I
Mhm.
it's really hard to underestimate the power of excitement and energy on an engineering team. And that's something you get in spades with these types of big shifts. You get people energized about a new solution or technology or way to build, and that's so powerful. And I think that's what React has always bet on. That's why React originally found success. It was challenging our norm of HTML goes here, CSS goes here, JavaScript goes here. And instead, we could kind of define those boundaries how we chose. I think the
Mhm.
magic of React is how it kind of threw away the HTML and gives us a better paradigm to think about how content is rendered. And where it's going is the natural next step in that sense. But it's so goddamn exciting to be part of. And when the core team's involved too, it's not just exciting, it's validating and easier to get buy-in at my companies and at my job and to my bosses when I'm still working at other places. And
Mhm.
the power isn't such that like they're picking a winner. It's more so that they are genuinely excited about this thing, and their actions, their collaborations, their releases, their social media, all of these things are indexing on that excitement from the core team to the developer shipping to users. And the thing I always am scared of whenever I see any community is not following the excitement. And when I see as much excitement as I do, like I feel like I hear about Nuxt more than I hear about Vue right now. And that's so
Well,
exciting to me.
okay.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
I see that as an
I mean,
opportunity.
that's a good thing. I think it has to do with the release cycle because Nux took a really long struggle to reach 3.0 stable. Uh, but once they got that out of the door, it essentially blocked them from iterating faster on these more. So like the road to 3.0 was really just like getting it stable, getting it every aspect of it. Like they planned for three, they want to get it polished. But after that, it really unblocked them and just like start thinking about newer, more exciting stuff. And for me, we felt a very similar like process for Vue. And the thing is, V3 after 2.2, we haven't done feature releases for a very long time, mostly because I spent a lot of time on Vite and splitting the time kind of really burned me out. But we are getting into new minor releases for Vue this year, so you're probably going to see some more hype about Vue Core in the next few months.
That's really exciting to hear. And I need to make sure
Yeah.
we make some time to talk about Vapor. But I do
Yeah.
want to challenge one thing as the community guy.
Mhm.
I was on the open source side and still am. Like Create T3 app's been super successful. It's so easy to align like community and release cycle as though that there's this like close relationship between them. But what I feel like I'm seeing with Nuxt right now, it goes well outside of the
Mhm.
release cadence and cycle. It's an excitement for opportunity, not for
Mhm.
like the specific features and around the release. And it's easy as a person whose job is to think about the releases all of the time to think about everything in relationship to that. I think what's going on goes beyond that.
That's great. I mean, I would be happy if Nuxt is like I was honestly a bit worried because we dragged Nuxt 3 for so long. But like any good news about Nuxt getting more hype is good news to me.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to go in on Vapor though, because this trend of compilers in our existing front end frameworks is so exciting. And yeah, I just rant.
Sure.
I don't know anything about it beyond you made a
Mhm.
compiler, something similar to React Forget. So tell us about it. What is Vapor? What's your goal? Why are you building this?
Yeah, it's not really React Forget. It's more like Solid, to be honest. It's Solid inspired in a way that so you
I'm
know that
obligated to
Vue.
say Ryan Carniato is the one who told me to ask.
Sure, yeah, yeah. So for the very first time I mentioned Vapor Mode, I mentioned it was Solid inspired. So it's if you think about Vue 2, like we switched to Virtual DOM in Vue 2 mostly because we wanted server-side rendering at the time, and we didn't really build a so in Vue 3 we kind of I guess there's a bit of history, right? So when we started working on Vue 2, we were like, okay, we want server-side rendering. And the most straightforward way to do server-side rendering is you have a virtual DOM and you just serialize everything you render on the server. And that is how React server-side rendering worked, right? So we built that in V2, but in V3, we rewrote the compiler again, and we realized, okay, like serializing virtual DOM on the server is actually slow. So V3's compiler actually can produce different output for the client and for the server. So on the server, it's similar to Svelte, where you just like concatenate strings as much as possible, right? Because you have a template. It's very easy to statically analyze the static parts and just like put them into a giant string, and then like use like string interpolation with the dynamic parts. So once we had that, we realized, okay, like the obviously there are other side benefits of virtual DOM where like it gives you some library authors prefer to write their components with virtual DOM because it gives them more flexibility than templates. Um, but in the end, we realized, okay, like if we don't really rely on virtual DOM for that. And if we can say build a compiler, because like we realize, okay, Solid is actually compiling JSX to, if you look at the output of Solid, it's pretty much doing static analysis on JSX. So if you have a big block of JSX with only one interactive binding inside of it, right? The default output of React is you still have to generate all these virtual nodes. And the default reconciliation is you have to diff all those nodes. But the way Solid compiles it, it's just giant block of string that's using clone node. You get a DOM tree, and you locate that specific node binding, and uh, you just bind it using signals, right? And in a way, signals are fundamentally the same reactivity system that Vue uses. So it all roots back to the same origin, like in Knockout, where you like have these explicit dependencies, and you have something that runs and tracks those dependencies and rerun. So the signals you see in Preact, in Quick, in Solid are all more, and in Angular today, are all more or less the same paradigm with what Vue has been doing. Uh, and we essentially expose the same primitives in composition API when we introduced that. So refs and watch effect are the equivalent of signals and effect. Um, and they like, if you ignore the implementation details, they are really the same thing. So when I looked at Solid's output, I was like, we can output very similar, like we can do this with Vue, and it would be a very natural fit. Um, and so it kind of occurred to me, okay, so what if we just drop virtual DOM and compile the same Vue templates, but into something that similar to what Solid is doing? And because we already have a server-side compilation target that's decoupled from virtual DOM, like this wouldn't really, the only thing we lose is for people to write manual render functions. But then again, if you can compile JSX into the same thing, so essentially, if you can compile Vue JSX and Vue templates into this same new compilation target, we don't lose anything in terms of expressiveness or server-side rendering capabilities, but we get better performance and smaller base bundle size because right now our when you ship a Vue app, like probably 15, 16 kilobytes of that is the virtual DOM runtime. And if you build an entire app with this new mode, you can drop the virtual DOM runtime, replace it with the Vapor time, which is going to be much lighter. Um, probably 60 to 70% lighter baseline. So and in a way, the greatest part of this is I believe we can introduce in a way that doesn't really affect existing usage, and it should be able to seamlessly interop with any existing Vue 3 app. So you just explicitly opting at per component level. Our current plan is you just rename your food.view to food.vapor.view, and it just gets compiled differently, but it still works in your existing application. So you can sort of starting converting the more performance sensitive parts of your app. So obviously the limitation is the initial rollout will probably be just a subset of the features, but this subset will be 100% compatible. So maybe it just lacks some more fancy stuff like transitions or stuff in the initial rollout, but you should be able to start replacing some of the very perf sensitive stuff with it, um, and get the benefit of it. And if you have a Greenfield app, great, you can start the whole app with the new mode. Um, that is generally the current idea. So it's more like, I guess like we, because the pain of the Vue 3 rollout, we're like, okay, we want to introduce these changes uh, in a way that you can adopt additively. Similar, I think the rollout of hooks is a success because the way you can just like incrementally introduce into it. If we started with composition API in Vue 2 core directly instead of in a new major version like in Vue 3, I think it would have much easier adoption ramp up as well, in hindsight. But I mean, you got to learn from your mistakes. So I hope. So I think Vapor is going to be something that's going to essentially. I think it also kind of overlaps with your point about creating, like, getting excited about it. Like the fact that if you're bringing something out new with a big caveat, it's hard to be genuinely excited about it. So, so with Vapor, we kind of want to reduce all these caveats and just like, this is pure game. You should be excited about
Yeah.
it.
I feel that hard. I think that the other aspect is to do something different in a way that you can talk about it with your coworkers realistically. Like with hooks, it was, oh, look at how much better this is, and we can do this in our existing app by turning this thing on. And it sounds like you found that
Mm-hmm.
with the like have a custom file extension or something. That is
Mm-hmm.
the opt-in way for now. I do really like that. The curiosity I have is,
Mm-hmm.
do you see opportunity to further innovate on the actual like DX of Vue through this new paradigm? Like, does this enable patterns that couldn't have existed before that not only can exist now but will be performant?
So probably, so the new file format does give us some opportunities to, potentially ship some alternative syntax that's different from the normal Vue files. Like we have some proposals about like simplifying some syntax, but uh, it's like we have when you have a special file format, you have all these infrastructure around it, like IDE support, syntax highlighters, ESLint stuff, like everything they need to be coordinated. And having a new file extension may give us some opportunity in that. But this feature itself specifically right now is essentially focused as a performance optimization. I think there might be opportunities to explore how the hydration would work differently, um, in a way that we want to. So obviously the current direction is we want to output something similar to solid, but not like the good idea we want to take about is to essentially get as close to bare metal as possible in terms of the all the DOM operations that you need to perform to get something on the screen. So that may also have to do how you can ship the least amount of code and do the least amount of work when you have already server rendered markup. That may play into something with that, like kind of how quick serializes a bunch of stuff in your DOM so that it can restore the subscriptions directly on the client without running your actual component. Um, the idea of that. So when you have an alternative compilation target, uh, the extreme you can go about is, like the code you write is a component, but like Ryan mentioned this quite a few times, like component is an author time concern. Like the final output doesn't have to be a component. Like eventually what you want on the client is just some signals and subscription relationships and some event handlers. These are the bare minimum that you need to get a working app. And how do you convert from a component model that just exists in the user's mind to something that no longer exists? Like you're basically just converting a component tree into all these subscription relationships and event handlers. So that would be a more extreme form of closer to bare metal. Like that's something we want to try as well. Like right now, it's still kind of in an exploration stage, but we're kind of excited about this direction.
Yeah, this is just so beyond what I expected. It's so cool to hear. Like, this is basically like to the developer, this won't look too different, but like this is basically a rewrite of Vue, the framework, in a lot of ways. This is
Yeah, but we want to retain the exact
yeah,
same DX.
that's super cool. It's interesting because like this almost feels like the exact opposite of what React is doing, where they're trying to like extend where their DX goes in terms of like like what platforms it can target and how like the actual code works in our mental model around it almost entirely. They're like throw away your
Mhm.
current mental model for this one. The components look similar-ish, but now we have like async everywhere. The syntax has changed a whole bunch.
Mhm.
It's interesting seeing what the opposite looks like of we're confident in our DX, we're confident in the syntax, we're confident in single file components, the way we build these things, but we want it to work better. So here's how we're going to do that. It's
Yep.
just such an
Yep.
interesting like opposite approach.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you summarized it very well. Like we are. So I think during the whole phase of shipping composition API, we were honestly there were periods I was in self doubt. I was like, is this the right move? Right. But after we shipped script setup in 3.2, and the community started to actually warm up to the idea, and we are getting a much more positive overall vibe from the community, and they are actually really happy with composition API now. So this gives us the confidence to say, okay, like our DX is good, so we want to actually retain that DX and give you something, give you a better, more performant app by default, just without you having to do anything.
Yeah, I love that. And the composition API is something I've heard quite a bit about from all sides. Even immediately after you say that in chat, people are composition API for the win. So good. People are hyped on that. Like, that's really cool to see. And yeah, it's nice to go. It's like a nice TikTok of you do that, and now you make the actual compiled output entirely different. Then maybe new patterns are discovered with that new compiled output. We go back and rethink some of the patterns, and then we go more into optimization. I think that TikTok of like the back and forth, the pendulum swing of go from DX to DX to performance is how software actually improves. If we focus too much on one, we end up leaving the other behind. And I think React had us thinking way too much about DX and not enough about the performance of the applications we shipped or the standards that we were building on top of or the browser as a whole. We flipped way too far the other way for a bit where we were all in on server everything. But I think as we swing back and
Yeah.
forth, finding a good place for applications and for the web.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a way, like I guess like we like again, I said we are definitely open to exploring the server first paradigm, but I guess we are not so huge like focused on that at the moment, mostly because we feel that, you know, something like Vapor Mode could also provide drastic improvements in terms like just the default amount of code you ship and the
Mhm.
hydration performance. Um, it's gonna make the default use case so fast that like it's gonna, I guess there's just this sort of there's this threshold where like the typical amount, the typical app you build is going to be so fast that when you like we I guess I want to go back a little bit because like when we compare paradigms, we often like say, okay, like this paradigm is better than this paradigm, but like there are a lot of variables at play, right? Like uh not all SPAs are equal. Not all like full hydration apps are equal. It kind of depends on your implementation.
Mhm.
A full page hydration, like people think, oh, it's going to be slow, but in reality, like if you make it fast enough, even you're hydrating the whole page, it can be incredibly fast. Um, and it probably is enough for your use case, right? So it's more of a pragmatic like thing you have to kind of compare in your actual use case rather than just categorically say this is not gonna work and we're just gonna go to another completely different paradigm.
Yeah.
Um,
The
yeah.
the one piece I would challenge here is like, what is the server is a
Mhm.
very wide spec. Like,
Yeah,
I
honestly.
disagree with Next's choice to continue supporting static export. I don't think it belongs in Next, but they have insisted. And honestly, now that it is fully compatible with the new server component model, it's actually a good
Mhm.
way to build a bunch of static HTML files for the various
Yeah.
routes. And you can define in your config, like, here are the routes that we want to generate for. And then you
Mhm.
don't need a server.
Yeah.
You need just a CDN and a bucket to throw your HTML and JavaScript files in, and it will generate an optimal static site that isn't just one HTML file anymore. But I think that
Mhm.
one of the benefits of these frameworks isn't that like server side means you need to run a JavaScript server to build a Vue or React app. It's you have to run a JavaScript build step in a server somewhere. It could just be on your machine. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
But the concept of sending the right HTML to the user is a value that I think all frameworks should
Mhm.
consider. And
Yeah.
while I agree not everything needs a JavaScript backend, I disagree that not everything needs some level of HTML preprocessor, be it a build step or a
Mhm.
server step, to have a more optimal experience both for the developer and user.
Yeah. I don't think we're disagreeing there. I
Mhm.
think that makes
Yeah.
sense. And yeah, one thing that kind of also occurred to me is that I guess our reservation about say like recommending Nuxt as the default is that people still use build web apps in many different ways. In a way, like
Mhm.
if you live in the React world, you feel like Next is the obvious way to build things. But there are tons of people out there building web apps that's based on Rails, Laravel, or Django, or they have a existing backend that they just have to work with. And for them, when they look at the solution, they still want something that's client by default because that is the only thing they can actually use in their situation. Um, so in a way, like I guess using something like Next is when they do have control over the whole stack, then you have a much easier, like much less constraints in making the decision. But like when they're looking for something that's like, okay, I just want the client side. Um, Not saying React cannot do that anymore, right? React still
Mhm.
can perfectly do that. It's just the way you introduce this thing for someone to look at it on first sight. Uh, I feel like React is going to lose a lot of people like not familiar with the whole situation, and they're like, I have a backend app, I want to add a front end to it, and oh, you're asking me to use a full stack framework? That's not gonna work for me. You know, I guess it could be something that happens.
I Yeah, but I think we're losing even more people when they go to the Vue docs, they start a Vue project, they put it up on Google, they send the link to their friend, and the metadata is wrong, even though they updated it in the Vue app to change the head tag correctly. The JavaScript doesn't run before the like actual like pass that like Twitter or Discord do to read the HTML, get that metadata, and now when you send a social media link to somebody, the
Ah,
card's
I
incorrect. And
see.
like these types of things are inherently wrong with client side, and the thing that these frameworks unlock isn't like
Yeah. So,
dependent on like I don't think you have to run it on a server, and
mm,
even if you do, it's often better to do your API requests on your server than on the user's
yeah,
device. It
yeah,
both in the like I think the case you're describing is better than you give it credit, and I don't think it is as necessary as you're pushing. I think that these frameworks
right.
provide value
Okay.
as a server side preprocessor that doesn't have to run on a server. It could run on my GitHub CI. It could run when
Hmm.
I build locally. But building the right HTML, even if the right HTML is you have 4 different routes that have the metadata
Mhm.
pre-packaged on them, and then it loads totally client-side view from there. Like,
Okay, so let me frame it this way. So I think the current way React introduces itself to users is essentially saying we have this. So assuming next is the default recommendation, right? So we have this great framework that is able to do things, all the things you want to do. Like it can be a full stack with a server. It could be just exporting to static. So you can use it in different ways, but you're all using the same thing. Like, um, but the default is you want to use next, right? I think that makes sense. Like, so the way we approach it a bit differently is like if you read the Vue intro page, we also start by saying Vue is a framework that is the progressive framework that is designed to cater to different use cases. So we actually explicitly list the cases you might want to use it for. So if you have an existing backend, you want to just enhance some HTML, you want to build an actual single page application, you want to have a full stack app, you want to have a statically generated app. So we actually list these use cases and we give you different recommendations based on what kind of thing you want to build. I guess we just want to get the message clear from the get-go that there are different things you might want to build. And so from the Vue ecosystem, we don't believe currently there is a silver bullet. So you need to be aware of what you're going into. Uh, and, you know, I just prefer to get this message kind of clear up front. Whereas what I fear about having this sort of default recommendation is people can say, okay, Nux allows me to do this, so I'm just going to use everything it provides without realizing this may be an overkill for my use case or something like that.
I I would have to know more about like what Nuxt does or doesn't provide. I do love the
Mhm.
idea of a minimal starting point. I I think the best approach is always going to be the minimal starting point with the maximal conversion on excitement when like the
Mhm.
thing they have in mind becomes more accessible because the tool they're using has a path to it. And if your
Mhm.
docs and your tools and all of these things lead you to a path of most excitement, both for you and your users, that's when magic really happens. And I think there's always more opportunity for that. And
Mhm.
yeah, with everything going on, even just with like Vapor, I see a huge opportunity to talk with them more and figure out what it looks like to build the best starting point and ending point for anybody who wants to build with you.
Yeah. So I don't think we necessarily disagree on things. I think there could be multiple valid ways of doing things, and I think there are definitely things that we can think about from your take here. And I think you helped me better understand React's like overall position on this new paradigm here. So I really appreciate that. Uh, Obviously, I still have my own
Of
opinions,
course.
but I think this is something that's very valuable.
Yeah, and this was super enlightening for me. I had no idea just how much Vapor changed things. That was super cool to hear about. I loved learning all about how you ended up both like feature creeping your way to a framework and then eventually feature creeping your way to a framework builder tool, and all that was so cool. I have 2 more quick things I wanted to make sure I got out. First is I know we touched on it a bit with Vapor, but just in general, your thoughts on signals
Mhm.
as the whole framework wars starts to get build a bunch of hype around the concept.
Yeah, I feel like Signos is right. We are. It's like picking up an old idea and suddenly everyone is excited about it. Like I mentioned multiple times, it's this whole paradigm exists way before all the popular things right now, like Knockout started in like 2009, and it had almost the exact same thing in it. People just, I guess Knockout didn't expose the effect primitives and the default way it encouraged people to use signals just didn't allow for the kind of composability that we have today. But like really, the ingredients were there, and and if you look at the way Knockout created observables, it's very similar to like you use it by calling the function. It's like almost the same as solid signals. Uh, so I'm not saying that it's not like solid. Actually, I think the biggest contribution is that its use of signals and the way it built it created this compilation output that is a really good use of signals in the way that you have a piece of static DOM and you use signals to surgically bind stuff inside of it. Um, in a way, View One kind of worked that way, but View One did it by actually creating the DOM from your template and then walking it and converting these bindings one by one. So it's less efficient than
Mhm.
a head-defined compilation, right? We like to be completely honest, when I built View One, I had no idea how to write compilers. So I was like, I don't know how to do this. I'm just gonna throw it into the DOM and walk the DOM,
I
right?
don't think the thought of a
Uh,
JavaScript compiler was particularly common at the time either, to be fair. And now it's
yeah,
like necessary to get your feet wet.
yeah, but it's kind of fascinating how like this idea has existed all along, and in a way like people are now getting excited it. I think when we released composition API, uh, like it's a bit ironic because a bunch of you users hated it because it looked like React hooks. React users didn't pay much attention to it because they feel like it's just something irrelevant to them. Um, and but when Solid got more popular, React users look at Solid and they feel very familiar because it's JSX, it's function components, everything looks like React, except signals gets around some of the pitfalls of hooks. Like you're actually running the function only once, and they find that refreshing. Uh, so I think it's just being marketed at the right time to the right audience is probably quite important on this aspect. And obviously, Quick introduced signals as well. Like I think Quick's initial proxy-based state management was actually more or less influenced by View Composition API because I actually talked with uh, sorry, I forgot who exactly on the team I talked to, but someone explicitly mentioned to me that Quick's state management was partially influenced by View Composition API. And obviously, they bought more into the signals hype to ride that train uh, with all the marketing. But I think right now, if you look at it, Preact has signals, Quick has signals, Solid has signals, Angular started doing signals, and very interestingly, we were internally playing with a alternative API for like because right now view refs are deep by default, and that actually in some situations it may not be the best default if you're super sensitive to perf. So we were thinking about, and shallow ref felt like something that's tucked away. We want to bring it more upfront, so we were like proposing a new internal proposal about a new API, and it looked almost exactly the same as Angular signals. I was like, did they actually read our internal discussion or what? Uh, but I think we just like somewhat just came to the similar API design. Uh, Obviously, that thing we didn't really put it out because we feel like refs are still good. It's just like we're like, I guess the point is we're always looking at these different ways of doing things. But uh, I think fundamentally, it's good that this sort of fine-grained reactivity primitives, automatic tracking kind of paradigm is getting more attention because I think it's a great paradigm. It allows you to build very and with the right tooling, you can actually build very predictable systems that, like, contrary to a lot of beliefs from the React people, like, because React always promoted this sort of functional top-down. Everything is just a function. It makes it easier to reason about. View is a function of your state. Blah blah blah. Um, from our side, I don't think Signal breaks that mental model at all. Like Signals is just a declarative way for you to say this thing will use this, and if it changes, this thing should update. That's really the most basic way of declaring reactivity relationships. And it's still declarative because you're setting everything up very explicitly. And there are runtime mechanisms allows you to understand situation. I think Solid has built a dev tool that allows you to visualize the relationship between your signals. Vue offers you like when you're running an effect in Vue, a watcher in Vue, you can actually passing debug options to say to just like put a debugger there, and you can know exactly when a dep change has triggered this effect to run, and you can trace to see which exact dep it is, or you can say, so we give you all that kind of stuff for you to debug this kind of thing. So it's, I think for a very long time we get a bad rap for like, oh, like Vue is mutable state. It makes your app harder to understand than the functional style, and I never think that is the case. Like we can provide you with great tools for you to understand your app and make sure like your reactivity, like some, yeah. So overall, the point I'm making is there are multiple paradigms that can work for you. It may have to do with which mental model you prefer. And I think it's a fact that for a lot of people, the Signals mental model just works better than the Hooks mental model.
Yep.
And but you know, it could be the contrary for someone else. So
That's
it's not about which one is right or wrong. It's about which one works better for you.
Yeah. What's been interesting for me is how do I put this? Well, Solid started because to Ryan, the signal model was easier to work with, understand, and scale. He loved it in Knockout. He wanted something modern like it. And Knockout was obviously a very direct inspiration for Solid. He's been very transparent about that from day one. What he didn't expect, and what honestly I didn't either, is for so many additional developers to find those patterns more intuitive to work with as well. And a lot of developers have found using Solid for a lot of use cases to be more pleasant than even React coming from React. In a lot of ways, it's very different and a bit of a mindfuck, but in a lot of ways, it's really compelling. And it's so cool having like components become imaginary and seeing the data flow in a more data-driven way. One thing you mentioned that was super interesting to me is the idea that like your proposal and Angular's proposal were so similar. Well, I agree that signals aren't the end all be all. It's not the mental model everyone's going to want to pick up. React in components weren't either. MVC seemed like it would be around forever and we would be using that in the client forever. But generally speaking, we as a whole moved overall away from it. And what I'm trying to gauge is how much is signals a thing that a few people prefer versus how much is this going to become the new default. And when statements like Angular and Vue thought up the same thing internally around the same time are being made, that seems less like a trend and more like a moment. And that's what's exciting to me here.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like a specific API surface.
Mm-hmm.
It optimizes a few different things than our current API. I didn't really put it out publicly, mostly because it's quite different from the default experience in Vue. But I think that's the natural decision you would arrive at if these are the things you want to prioritize in that design. And I think it's also because fundamentally, like, it's just, I actually wrote a section about this in Vue docs that's just showing like we can simulate solid style signals with Vue shallow refs in 10 lines. We can simulate Angular style signals with Vue shallow refs also in 10 lines. So like they are all fundamentally the same paradigm, but we can maybe have different higher level API surfaces with different like emphases. Like Vue's API uses the dot value, like Preact signals also use dot value. Quick's API also use dot value. These are more like trying to cater to the sort of treat this as a normal object property. You want to just mutate it at will. Whereas Solid's API, you have to use a tuple similar to React. It emphasizes the read-write segregation, like you can pass the signal around without passing its setter. So it gives you more safety about state ownership. And then the Angular style makes your intention of updating the state more explicit by requiring you to always use function, like use a method like signal dot update or signal dot set. Like it's just more explicit. Like so, this is kind of encourages you to always think about your signals more like a piece of state you are managing rather than. Whereas with the dot value interface, it's more like a variable. It's just like a closer to a variable, right? So these are different.
As a functional programmer, I definitely have my preferences, but I do like that way of putting it. It's like, do you like interfacing with variables or do you like interfacing with functions? It's similar to why I really don't like Svelte in a lot of ways. I feel like Svelte changed what the equal sign means, and that scares me personally. It's
Yeah,
like,
I think that triggers a lot of people's like, oh, doesn't feel right.
mhm.
That was my initial reaction too. And there's some anecdote here because like um, the night before React Hooks was announced, Rich Harris, Dan Abramov, and I actually met up in New York City. We had just a private gathering with a bunch of other folks, and so we talked about stuff, and they mentioned, oh, we have a big feature releasing tomorrow, and we had no idea what it is. And the next day, we found out, okay, this is quite different from how React worked, and that kind of got me to start thinking about composition API, and that got Rich to start thinking about Svelte 3. So in a way, both composition API and Svelte 3 are influenced by React hooks, and I still remember the thread that Rich put out on Twitter. He was like, "Oh, like maybe we can do Svelte this way." And in the next few hours, he was like, "My thoughts evolved. We can actually do this. What if like assigning this thing actually just triggers reactive changes?" And I was like, "This is like not JavaScript anymore. It's like Svelte script." And it was like, "Hell yeah!" And then he just went whole like all in on that direction, uh,
I'll never
which
forget the
is
Svelte is a language now
yeah,
post.
yeah. And I think that that worked out well for them. Like we also explored this direction a little bit in Vue. We actually had a proposal called reactivity transform that does the same thing that allows you to just like declare variables as reactive and assign it to it will trigger changes. But in the end, we felt like it just didn't fit with the kind of overall usage that we're seeing. Like uh, the trade-offs, right, that we are having is like we want the code to work the same in and out of components. So you can use hooks outside of React components, and you can also use composition API outside of Vue components. And that allows you to just move things in and out and extract things, reuse things very easily. So we see that value. So we felt like, okay, like this is probably not the direction that we want to go with. But like it's always fascinating because like I'm like I'm probably like I'm always open to just look at what other frameworks are doing and feel like, okay, is this the right fit for Vue? Like if it's the right fit, like we have really just like feel like, okay, if it makes Vue devs' lives easier, you know, we'll take that idea.
I like that approach a lot. I realized I've entirely forgotten to do an important shout out, which is render ATL. If that mention that Evan had there of the little talk he had with Rich Harris and Dan Abramov sounds like the kind of thing you want to be able to be part of and the place you want to be. Render ATL is one of the coolest. And huge shout out to Justin for making this whole interview possible. If you're interested in going to Render ATL, it's a awesome web dev, I guess React focused, but not necessarily, web dev conference in Atlanta. And yeah, so there's a discount code for 10% off if you do the render command in Twitch chat. I will link this in the YouTube chat as well if anybody's interested. It's going to be an awesome event. And I don't actually remember if I've even asked before, but Evan, what's your talk about at Render ATL?
It's actually about like thinking across framework boundaries. It
Huh?
ties in a lot into how, you know, if we look at under the API surface, how things are more similar than different at a fundamental level. Like I probably talk about signals. I talk about the ideas that Vue learned from other frameworks and the ideas that has been like how like ideas propagate through different frameworks, like how React hooks influence composition API and Svelte and all that. Um, yeah, I guess the
Mhm.
theme of the talk is to encourage everyone to look at the web dev ecosystem more as an interconnected system instead of a silos. Because for a very long time, I feel like a lot of devs, they start with the framework and they just live inside that walled garden, and everything they learn about is only about that framework. But I feel like it's valuable for you to step out and look at all these options, even if you're not going to maybe use them for your day job. It's still valuable to see the different trade-offs these different solutions are making. uh, I think it's going to be beneficial in the long run.
Absolutely agree. That's so cool. And yeah, it's awesome to know the talk's going to be relevant to web devs and all frameworks as well. It's Yeah, super exciting. That's going to be an awesome one. I'll be sure to stop by for that. And I think I'm actually going to have some form of setup there. We're still figuring out the details, but I'm going to be live streaming one of the days at the event. So if you're down to stop by and talk about some stuff, that'd be super cool to have you there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Only other question, and I will kick myself if I don't get to this one. Do you remember my issue with query params in Vite?
Yeah, I do. So it's unfortunate, right?
Yeah,
I
TLDR
guess we
for
landed.
chat because people listening aren't going to necessarily know. I was a really early and heavy Vite user, and I was also an early and heavy Vercel user. And I wanted to use Vite to make a client-side app while using Vercel's API directory to get data through Vercel, which should have been fine and simple. The catch is, in order to use that API directory locally, I have to use Vercel's CLI. So I was running Vite through Vercel's server locally. And Vite has a specific quirk in query params where it uses $dev, file, and a few other query params that aren't technically formatted to JavaScript standard. They are formatted as correct query params, but for it to be parsed correctly by JavaScript, it needs key equals value. So when the Vercel CLI would unwrap the URL, it would do such. It would get a function URL, but then it would rewrap it. So it wouldn't be $dev, it'd be $dev equals true. And Vite couldn't handle the URL formatted that way. And it broke everything.
Yeah, so we never really expected the use case. Like we never expected like the Vite query would run through another server that somehow changes it. The thing is because of the use of the rollup plugin pipeline internally, like so there are proposals, for example, like using a custom URL prefix, I think would probably be a better choice, but it was kind of too late to change that because a lot of plugins are already written relying on that pattern. So this is kind of something we only realize in hindsight. And the other aspect of it is we've always been wanted to replace the custom params with some different mechanism. But the thing is, you may get additional HTTP headers when you're working with a real server, but inside the plugin pipeline, everything we get is just one ID string. So we have to encode a lot of additional information in that so that the plugins can sort of pick those query strings and do the right thing. And there's really no other way for us to encode that information other than the query string. So
yeah, I'm cool with the query strings. The only issue is the formatting of them. Like you need a key value for a valid query param. If it was just dev equals true, would be good. But it's $dev. And then when so all that Vercel's server is doing, the only thing it does is it takes the URL, it throws
formatting
it
to the right format.
Yeah, it creates a new URL just using like the URL like JavaScript helper so that it can parse it, and then it restringifies it and sends it back out. But as it makes a URL from the string and then restringifies that, it changes from dev to dev equals true because that's the valid format.
Does it still not handle that correctly? I mean,
it probably does by now. I haven't tried this for a while, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
But it was like I spent like on and off pushing on this for about 8 months, and I ended up just giving up, writing a really frustrated blog post on how to fix it client side, on like how to fix it on your end and moving on.
Yeah, because
I even patched the Vercel CLI to use the original URL instead of using the reparsed one in order to get around it.
Yeah, maybe we just we get so many issues. This one just like felt like a really niche case, so it kind of gets pushed down by all the other things that were kind of like more important.
That makes a ton of sense, and I think it's part of how I framed it too, because I framed it around the Vercel CLI, but that like the Vercel CLI wasn't doing anything crazy here. It was just parsing the URL, and like if you take a valid Vite URL, put it in like new URL in the browser, and then use what comes out of it, that won't work with Vite. It might now, but it didn't at the time.
Sorry. Yeah. I think this sounds like a pretty straightforward fix. I guess if there were a PR, we would probably just merge it.
I think I made one and you rejected it.
Oh, you did? Really?
Yeah, I am almost positive. That's why I had the gripe.
Okay.
I'll look through the notes to be sure in the future. But yeah, I'm also down to just go test this because I'm curious. But like, yeah, I'm positive now that it was just a misunderstanding, and I am much more excited to either go see it's already fixed or go fix it myself. So yeah, that was the only bone I had to pick. I am pumped that you were here. thank you for everything. Actually, one more compliment, because there's a compliment I made in the past that didn't get communicated properly. Thank you for raising the bar for international open source communities.
Oh, yeah.
You're one of very few that pushed that, and you pushed it really far. Like, the thing I have noticed personally in my community is that the people who are asking about Vue are not just the everyday, like, $200,000+ a year web dev bros. It's people all over the world that feel like they're part of something. And that's like, feeling like you're part of a movement is so much more powerful than any technology you can learn. And the amount Vue has enabled that for people who aren't here is incredible. And
Thank you. Yeah, and sorry for that tweet.
no
I
worries.
really read it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And like, I always said about that, because like, it was the thing I was saying was what was important, not what I put on the diagram. I just put something dumb. I didn't post that diagram. I never would have. Somebody screenshotted a moment during my stream and posted that. So I had no control over the message that was shared.
I totally got it pushed to me by Twitter just out of context. And yeah, I think the tone of the guy who posted it was already kind of negative. So just like,
no, actually, I think his was positive, if I recall. The original tweet was positive,
really?
but somebody quote tweeted it negative, which is probably what you saw. Yeah.
I think I directly saw the quote retweet. So I was like, wait.
Yeah. Makes tons of sense.
Yeah.
No hard feelings at all. I just wanted to make sure you understood my goal there was to say specifically, Vue set a high bar here. And the like exact quote was, I use React. If I'm running the team, we're using React, unless our team has people that are already deep in the Vue ecosystem and care about these things in these ways. I absolutely am going to learn Vue at that point. Like, even I, the React bro, would move my stack to Vue given these strengths applying to my team.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. So I also want to give you a shout out because, like, to be 100% honest, I was really, for a very long time, I was annoyed by the whole tech influencer culture. I was like there's so many grifters just posting useless stuff on Twitter and like
They
creating
all
these.
hate me.
Yeah. So
That's bad.
So I think when I posted that tweet, I kind of unconsciously just grouped into that kind of, but I looked at your content later, and this conversation, it really kind of makes me feel you are, like you're doing something different. And I really appreciate, like, even though you are a big React proponent, you are also kind of open to, say, have this conversation with me. And I think that was a really valuable conversation. So yeah, thank you for the thing you do.
I appreciate it a ton. I think I have the exact same frustrations you do around how grifty and obnoxious everything felt. Like, some of you in chat just said that they blocked and unblocked me like 50 times on Twitter because they were so conflicted on how to feel about me. And I get it. Like, I look and act like an influencer in a lot of ways, but the reason I did it is, like, I worked at Twitch for 5 years. I know how YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and these platforms work. I've always been excited about that, but I ignored it because I cared way more about making good software and building with these tools and just being a developer. What absolutely like blew me away was, so what happened to me is I quit Twitch. I no longer had my community of hundreds of engineers I looked up to talk with about this cool stuff every day. I wanted that back. So I started my YouTube and my Twitch just to have a place to talk with more senior engineers. And I was one of the first to know how to do that with like a nice camera and a decent production. And it seems like I made something a lot of other people wanted to. And that's what was special about me. It's nothing necessarily about me. There's a lot of people who feel the way we feel. Hundreds of them are watching right now. Shout out to each and every one of you. But it was that we all wanted this. We all wanted a fun, shitposty place to talk about how the future of the web will work. We're not just here to tell people, buy these 15 courses and you'll be a programmer someday. We're here to really push software forward. And because of that, both sides kind of hate me because the software devs see a YouTuber, which they're used to always being bad. Like, the Redux maintainers have come at me because they think I am irresponsible because I don't know what it's like to be a maintainer. I'm just a YouTuber. And then on the YouTuber side, they hate me because I'm not here to like do things the way they do. I don't really like the way they do things, and they feel insecure about it. And the result is a lot of people have reason to shit on me, and I get it. I don't really care too much because for every one person who does, there's a cooler person who ends up like you, seeing through it, coming on the show, and making something fucking awesome happen for the future of the web. And the coolest thing throughout this has been how awesome the people are that you don't let the bullshit keep them from having the conversation. And I was very scared you wouldn't be down. And the fact that you were has once again reinforced my, to be frank, childhood belief of you proved how cool open source and software can be. And I appreciate you a ton for the time, man. Seriously. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, we're going to wrap up here. I don't think I'm going to go anymore after this, so I'm just going to end it. Thank you all again so much for stopping by. Make sure you check out Render ATL if you want to come to one of the coolest web dev conferences in America. One more disclaimer on that, because I think it's important. Don't go there if you don't have a job in software and you think it's a place to get one. Ideally, have your employer pay for it. This is not don't go to conferences and spend thousands of dollars in hopes of finding your first job. That's all I have. Thank you again, Evan. This was awesome.